welcome to the webinar. My name is Sheila Jaivant and I used to work at Hinduja Hospital. I'm a writer and I've been involved with the end-of-life care movement as well as I take a particular interest in the living will. I was caregiver to my mother, so I have first-hand experience there and some experience with friends' parents as well as patients and their caregivers in the hospital. Handing over to Dhwani Mehta.
Thank you, Sheila. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dhwani Mehta. I'm a lawyer and co-founder of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, which is a think tank based out of both Delhi and Bangalore that does legal research to assist governments in drafting legislation and generally identify areas for legal reform. We've been working on the issue of end-of-life care since 2014. Along with the End-of-Life Care in India Task Force, we've been involved in interventions in the Supreme Court to ask for legal validity to be given to living wills or advanced medical directives. And we've also been working on a draft law that can operationalize, that can create a better and more stable legal framework for both end-of-life care decision-making and advanced care planning in particular.
Hi. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Dr. Roop Gursahani, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about living wills and advanced care planning. And it's indeed a great pleasure for me. For some time, we have been working on this, and it was in some ways because of the COVID pandemic, we had thought that we would have to literally go around the country speaking about this issue. And it was a COVID pandemic which forced us online, and we suddenly realized that we actually had a wider audience because of that. So thank you everybody who's already here, and we will I'll be speaking, then the three of us, the panelists, we will be discussing the issue amongst us, because there will be questions from the audience as well. And those questions, it's good if you start posting them right away, because that helps us collate questions, put questions together, and it's useful for us because this is something that we expect a lot of you to have a lot of questions about. Knowing what those questions are will help us make lectures like this better, so that we can in advance try and cover what is important for you. So I'm not going to waste any more time. We are at 4:06 and I'm now going to get started. Is that okay? Dhwani, Sheila? Yeah, okay. So living wills and advanced care planning. Now, all of you will have heard about living wills because there has been a fair amount of publicity for this over the past year or so. And it's important for us to realize that we are actually far behind the rest of the world on this issue. And as you hear from me, you will realize why this is so. So let me begin with a story that came up a little over 2 years ago. A senior citizen couple from Mumbai actually wrote to the president saying that they had no children, they were alone, and they wanted the president to actually sanction their euthanasia. And in fact, they wrote some more that they would, if not, then they would, one of them would kill the other so that that person would then be sentenced to death. Now, to my mind, this kind of thinking is in some ways like asking for a rescue team to come in and do the job that in some ways you should be taking on. And I think I did mention that to a couple of journalists who spoke to me about this, but I really don't know where that story has gone. But let me take you after that to Japan. And this dark and gloomy picture is of a housing complex on the outskirts of Tokyo, which began in the 60s. And as people grew older, the original residents were all that were left. And it's symbolic for something that has in Japan been called kodokushi, or lonely death. Many of these are occupied by old senior citizens, and the only way that the rest of the world knows that they have passed on is when the stench is perceived. For people who are from the LGBT community, many may be without immediate family and are dependent on friends. So that's another lot of people who need this kind of document and support structure. But all of us need to understand that more and more of us are going to be living alone as time goes on. And it is something to do with basic, you can call it economic progress. You look at the graph on the screen, and it shows you Norway at the top. 35% of people live alone. In India, 5%. But look at the figures in between. China, 15%, South Korea, 25%. So as we get more and more advanced, as we get more urbanized, more and more of us are going to be living alone. And this is a reality that we need to face. Now, when people are asked about where they would want to pass away, and these are studies that have been done on the street, people have just been asked randomly. 90% of us want to die at home in our own beds. But in reality, 70 to 80% of people actually, even today, die in hospital. But there is a bigger worry that many people have, and that is of dying with pain and suffering. And Woody Allen said that best. He said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." To prevent that from happening, this is the solution that the world has devised 4 decades ago, and that is now pretty much very clear elsewhere. It's called a living will. I've given you a sample here, and I'll be discussing this in a little more detail a little later. So think of a trip. Would you like to plan it? Would you want information about travel, stay, etc.? These are 2 iconic travel movies, Dil Chahta Hai and Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara. And these are friends who jumped into a car and started their journey. At this age, I'm in my 60s. I can't imagine doing that. I need to know what the loos will be like. I need to know what the beds will be like. I need to know that there'll be a reservation for me. What will be the food like? And I need planning. So think of the last journey of your life. Or else, I mean, to be really honest, think of what you want your illness experience to be like. Now, many of us are not aware that it's not as though there are zillions of ways of dying. There are not. Statistically speaking, there are just 4. There are some other variations, but these are the 4 main ones. Sudden death, where somebody is functioning completely well, high functioning, and suddenly just drops dead. Now, if you remember, our former long-haired president was in his 80s. He was lecturing, and he literally had a heart attack and he passed away. So doing what he wanted to do. But to get a exit like that takes a lifetime of punya. Typically, sudden deaths occur before the age of 50. So you can understand that. Young men in battles, young men without helmets riding motorcycles, ad executives smoking their way to a sudden heart attack, and so on. All of this happens by the age of 50. By the time you cross your 50s, your systems have stabilized. And less than 10% of people die suddenly. The next major type of death is terminal illness or cancer. And here too, people are well functioning in this day and age, chemotherapy and so on will keep people going. But once the first chemotherapy fails, and definitely by the time the second chemotherapy fails, typically when the first one fails itself, people enter what we call the Niagara Falls trajectory, where you can predict that death will occur after a certain period of time. And again, most of these start off in the 60s. And you will remember this picture of the former Goa Chief Minister, Manohar Parrikar. Cancer accounts for about 20% of all deaths. In the 70s, people who have had long-standing diabetes, hypertension, and so on will start to develop organ failure. So lungs, heart, kidney, liver will start to fail. And as it fails, as the organ fails, these people end up running into crisis. And as they run into crisis, they will have recurrent admissions. So you can see that they go into hospital, they come back not so good, and again they go in, and until they finally pass away during a crisis. We call this the looping trajectory. Typically, as I said, this happens in the 70s, and I have not put a VIP photograph because VIPs get transplants. About 15% of people will have this trajectory. And then come the people who have survived into their 70s, into their 80s, function is relatively low. And then they start to gradually deteriorate, go down slowly over a period of time. This has been called the dwindling trajectory. And typically people pass away in their 80s. So you remember, I mean, this is Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And this will be the lot of the 50% of us who take good care of ourselves and reach that age. Many of these people will also have dementia. So what does this mean? If you remove the people with sudden deaths, for about 85 to 90% of us, death is predictable. Some weeks, some months, maybe a year or so before it actually occurs, it can be predicted. And yet, this was a WhatsApp forward that came not too long ago. Janm aur mrityu ab महंगे हो गए हैं. Life and death have become expensive. Nobody is born without a cesarean and nobody dies without a ventilator. Ironic. But that's not true everywhere in the world. This came on my Twitter feed a couple of months ago. And read this. My grandfather passed away today. All that he wanted to do last night was to have one last beer with his sons. I can't imagine that happening in India, and certainly not in an Indian hospital. So it has been said that India is not a country to die in. And somebody actually looked at quality of death. They did a survey of multiple parameters. And when they did it in 2010, it's been done recently also, we were the last of 40 large countries. In 2015, when it was repeated, we had improved. In fact, they had found 13 countries worse than us, and fortunately both China and Pakistan were below us. So what are the problems? Why do Indians die badly? And this survey has basically identified three major problems. One is we are not willing to talk about death. So that loses our opportunity for last wishes. And a life review, which is an emotional setting of accounts, has been thought to be the most important thing that people want to do in their last days. They want to forgive, ask for forgiveness, and emotional, the accounts have to be settled. Then our laws, they don't permit patients or families to take control. Doctors are scared, and the legal system is worried about misuse. We'll discuss this a little later. So the default option, where everybody says, literally the Punjabi term is menu ki, the default option is to continue till the bitter end. And we have poor access to symptoms that can control suffering. So morphine, India is the largest supplier for the rest of the world. We produce more than 90% of the world's morphine. And yet, till some time ago, it was extremely difficult to prescribe it in India. More importantly, is not just physical pain. There's something called total pain. It's spiritual suffering. It is the family's issues. And you need professionals who can look holistically at what we call total pain, all suffering, all disease-related suffering. Those are the people who are trained in palliative care. And there are very few of them in India. But as I said, the first problem is the fact that we are not willing to talk about it. And this is something that was recognized at the time of the Mahabharata. The Yaksh, in the Yaksh Prashna, one of the questions was that he asked Yudhishthir, what is the greatest wonder? And Yudhishthir said, day after day, countless creatures reach heaven, yet those that remain behind believe themselves immortal. What can be more extraordinary than this? And so we have begun to believe that talking about death is itself apshakun. Now that's a little funny because Tibetan Buddhism insists on contemplating your death for about 5 minutes a day as an essential meditation practice. And it's a thriving community. I mean, they haven't died out because of thinking about it. So I think that is something that we should all remember. So coming back to the journey metaphor, think of the last journey of your life. And there are 3 questions. Who has the information? Who is planning? And whose responsibility is it to plan? And we'll address these. So who has the information? Now, from the time of Hippocrates, which is 4,000 years ago, foreseeing and foretelling was always the doctor's responsibility. I'm a doctor, but I also know that this is not an easy job. This is because patients expect us to prognosticate, which means to foresee and to foretell honestly, accurately, and optimistically. And you can imagine that this is a difficult thing to put together, but it can be done. And doctors can be trained to do this right. So because Indian doctors in general are not trained in the skill of delivering bad news, we subscribe to this rubbish of usko mat batao. And even patients and family need to understand honesty really is the best policy. If you hide this information, because this information cannot really be hidden, it worsens depression and anxiety in the patient. And, you know, rather than doing what it takes to control suffering, you're running around in circles hiding this information. And that really, really makes for a bad quality of life, death. Now, for any doctors here and for their patients, remember that this prediction is possible given some basic skills and information that we all as doctors need to have. One is a trigger. And you may have heard this of some intuitive, experienced doctor saying that I would not be surprised if so-and-so does not survive beyond so many months or years. And it has been proven that when an experienced doctor applies his mind to it, uses intuition, and this intuition will take in a lot of things. And he or she makes this judgment. This judgment has a fair amount of statistical validity. It has been shown in trials. Then general indicators of decline. So if you have somebody who is requiring more and more help on a day-to-day basis to take care of their daily things, meaning somebody who some time ago used to go out for a walk and today needs help to go to the toilet, that's a significant decline. So more and more self-care, or sometimes when people say enough is enough, I don't want more dialysis. And then there are specific indicators linked to illnesses. So for lung disease, there are markers which tell you that somebody's survival is not likely to be much. Now, there is an error rate of 30% when you take all patients and all doctors into account. This figure obviously drops depending on the diagnosis, the duration, and the years of experience, not just qualifications, the years of experience. So an experienced family doctor may be far better rated than a new um, excessively qualified consultant. But whatever we do as a doctor, with all humility, I have to remember that 100% answers are not going to be possible. And we all, patients, families, doctors, we all have to accept that there will be uncertainty. Now, till we reach the stage that doctors are willing to tell and their patients are willing to hear, when you give me this question, who has the information? The answer is don't ask and don't tell. So this was a cover from The Economist which said how life ends. Death is inevitable, but a bad death is not. So the destination cannot be changed, but decisions can be made about how the journey should be. But it needs you to be aware and to take charge. And I believe that a good death in some ways can be defined. The first is to know when death is coming and to understand what can be expected so that you have the time to say goodbye, and preferably to control the time so that you can leave when it is time to go and not have life prolonged pointlessly. This means that you must have control to be able to maintain your dignity and to maintain your privacy, so especially choice over where death occurs and in whose presence. And this needs the advance directive or the living will. And then you need to have access to pain and all kinds of symptom control, including spiritual and emotional support, and sometimes hospice care towards the end. Two prominent figures passed away fairly recently. Irfan Khan, I mean, these are two quotes that really shook me. He said this to Nasiruddin Shah. The first is the one that I have written below. It is astounding that such a frail body can house so much pain. And then he's also said, how many people have the choice, have the chance to observe death coming at them? I'm lucky that I can see the thing approaching me and I can greet it. It's something that really shook me also. And then Rishi Kapoor remained jovial and full of life till the end. He focused on family, friends, food, films, and did not let his illness get him down. He was grateful to his fans, and he said he would like to be remembered with a smile. So you can understand what I mean when I say a good death. So this brings me back to who is planning a last journey. And the choice is you or someone you trust. Because the default mode where nobody plans is what causes the worst suffering. When there is nobody able or willing to make decisions. Because if you take decisions, then suffering can be minimized and you can get the palliative care that makes these days, well, maybe suffering cannot be completely controlled, but it can be reduced to a huge extent. And these choices right till the end are yours. If you can speak coherently, your choices and decisions always come first. So you can keep saying, as long as you're aware of what is happening to you, what you want and what you don't want. The problem is that if you ask me, can every patient who's dying decide right till the end? I will have to answer that in a slightly different fashion. Now, this brings me to a issue called decision-making capacity. Now, when I take your consent for a treatment, if I talk to my patient, I assess decision-making capacity instantly, almost all the time, every day. As I'm talking to my patients, I know whether they are able to understand the illness, they understand the consequences, they can make a judgment between options. So this is informed choice. You hear the choices that I'm giving you and you make the choice. The problem is that as life goes down, this decision-making capacity goes. There is something called active dying. This means when the body actually starts shutting down. This takes about hours to days, maybe about a week before the actual time that the heart stops. And during this period, decision-making capacity is usually gone. In cancer, this may happen even earlier, weeks. In people who have organ failure, that looping trajectory that I showed you, when they get into a crisis and they go into hospital, typically they don't have decision-making capacity. And people who have dementia can lose it years, decades before death. So does that mean that you will always lose control in the end? No, not if you plan for it. And this planning is the living will. Now, people ask, what is the living will? Why is the living will different from the standard will? The living will comes into effect when you cannot speak or communicate while you are alive. That is why living. Whereas the standard estate will comes into effect only after you are gone. So the terms that we use nowadays for these are not just living will, we call it the advanced medical directive or advanced care planning. The basis of this is the issue of autonomy, which says that I have the right to determine my own future, to accept or decline any treatment, or to decide who decides for me. Is this absolute? Well, in the West, it really is almost absolute. So if you choose to refuse a treatment which would save you, so be it. That's your choice. But in Asian societies, especially in India, it's relational. We exercise our autonomy in consultation with the people around us, those who matter to us, those to whom we matter. And this has also been called Swadharma. So the first decision that I think everybody needs to take is, do I decide? Or do I just decide who decides? Because if I avoid all discussion or decision making, then suffering by default is inevitable. So let's look at these. What are the people who say, I decide? Typically, many of them are autonomous. And one reason is they take responsibility for their own decisions because it's my own body. But there are also people who do it out of altruistic reasons, in the sense that I do not want to trouble anybody else with this decision making. So I will take this decision myself. But there are people who want to leave it to their families or their loved ones to decide. Ideally, it is transferred by explicit authorization, by telling them with clear guidance about what you would want. But there are people who will say, I absolutely trust so-and-so, and I will leave it to them to do the right thing, which is for me always a little tricky. And of course, there is always a small proportion of people who are avoiders. These are people who will say it's God's wishes or whatever. I don't want to hear about this, and so on. So fine. So when you make this choice of who will make the decision for you, typically many people would have put their spouse as number one. But it's always necessary to remember what happens if something happens to the couple together. For instance, in a car crash, and neither can speak for the other. These are pictures of couples who died together in accidents. So if possible, think of three people, not one, not two, three, who can accept this responsibility and are available. Put them in sequence. The first, the second, and the third decision maker. They are not a committee. They obviously will talk to each other, but only one person will decide. Okay, so the first person, if he's available, he or she is available, then he or she decides, then the next, then the next. The next decision obviously is the location of care. Now, as I said, 80% of people die in hospitals. And very often in India, that means an ICU. That is acute care. Become seriously ill, people rush you into an ICU. And I have asked my intensivist friends, people who run ICUs, whether they would like to die in their own ICUs. Nobody likes that choice. ICUs are terrible places. Lights are on constantly, there's continuous noise, and you are confused lying there, and strange masked people are doing painful things to you. Not a good choice. But some people might choose to end their last days in hospital, typically because they feel that things are difficult to manage at home, and then you have clear instructions not to go to the ICU. You also have something like extended care facility, which we call assisted living, but hospice, where people stay in their last days, where symptoms are managed, as of now in India are available across the board only for cancer, except in Goa. where there is a hospice which takes in all diseases. And then, of course, there is home. And worldwide, as I told you, when surveyed, the overwhelming majority prefer home. So this is where I have chosen, which would be, if I have choice towards the end, where I would like to pass my last days, my home in Goa. But if you say home, who will do the seva? In olden times, it used to be said to women that may you have 100 sons, and we know how that story turned out. In fact, now, and this has been said elsewhere also, may you have 3 daughters. At least one of those 3 daughters will give up a future to take care of you. But the cost of providing care is substantial. In the US, it goes up to $100,000. In middle class India, I know because I've been through this, it can go up to as much as 10 to 12 lakhs per year. So bankruptcy or impoverishment comes up. And with people with dementia, it can be as long as 10 years. So to manage this, we suggest this document. And I'm going to take you through the elements of this document. This is the Advanced Medical Directive. As you can see, it has identifying details, and it states that you're an adult. Typically, as of now, it is open for adults only. If the time comes that I can no longer take part in decision making regarding my medical treatment, this declaration will be my final wish. If I reach the stage of terminal illness or go into coma with no reasonable expectation of regaining consciousness, or I have no reasonable expectation of recovering with acceptable quality of life, or go into something called a persistent vegetative state, then this document, we require that a panel of 3 doctors should jointly take this decision. And if they confirm it, then treatments, specific treatments, these are called life-sustaining treatments, should be withdrawn. Now, these life-sustaining treatments include intravenous fluids, artificial feeding, even by tube feeding, dialysis, artificial respiration, which means a ventilator, chemotherapy, and something that you may have seen in a movie that's called cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I don't know if you have seen Western movies or medical serials, and a person suddenly falls down holding his chest, and some doctor comes rushing up and thumps the chest, and lo and behold, the person wakes up. That does not happen in real life. In real life, barely 5% of people who undergo cardiopulmonary resuscitation do well. And that too only if there is a doctor immediately around and they have access to all kinds of facilities there. Just 5%, remember that. So, if you do not want any of these treatments, then you either put that down in absolute black and white, or you appoint a surrogate decision maker or a healthcare power of attorney. Okay, and as I said, preferably there should be 3 persons. Now, you have the choice of either leaving this decision making to the surrogate or the power of attorney, or spelling these out and saying these have to be done, no discretion. And in which case, the power of attorney's only job is to make sure that the wishes are carried out. So these also, this level of discretion that is permitted, that also can be specified. And remember that this declaration stays during the lifetime of the individual, and that individual can revoke it orally, verbally, at any time. In fact, doctors, where these systems operate, are supposed to ask a conscious patient, you had this document, do you still wish this to be operated? And if the patient says, no, I don't want it, it's gone. So this document, which we have worked on, my group, will be available on these websites, Vidhi Legal Policy, Pallium India, and the Indian Association of Palliative Care, and you can download them and use them. Now, there are multiple such documents available. We made this simple document for India and for Indians. But remember, this is just a document. It requires a process and a system to make it effective. Now, if you look at any kind of medical technology, and if you look around you in private hospitals in India, I mean, it may be expensive, but you will realize that the latest medical technology in India is available usually a year or two after it gets invented in the West, and it becomes readily available there. And on this, we are 4 decades behind the West. Why? So let's look at how the system works in those countries and see what lessons we can draw. My own feeling is that the reason why it has not been imported is because the only people for whom it is really, really important are patients, also doctors, but patients. And unless there is a lobby to push something, unfortunately, things don't happen that easily. So the process that makes this work is called advanced care planning. So it's a process to guide decision making about your healthcare if and when you do not have the capacity to decide for yourself. Simple. It has 2 components. First is a proxy decision maker, and then the guidance for that proxy decision maker. So the advance directive. And that advance directive should say what type of life, what level of care, basically the living will. And actually it says what you hope for once illness comes upon you. How do you do it? It's actually a conversation. This conversation is between you, your family. If the power of attorney is not exactly in your family, then him or her and your family, your healthcare providers. And ideally, you should have counselors or facilitators who can make this conversation happen. And then this conversation is put down into a medical record, and then it feeds into a system that sees that it is acted upon. If anybody is interested in finding out how these conversations can be held, look at this, the conversation project. Easy to remember. Please look it up. It will tell you enough cues to begin this conversation at your home on your dining table. And as I said, it is used if and when you lack the capacity to be your own decision maker. And it provides guidance for both your power of attorney, your family, and your doctors. Now, if there is no decision and there is no decision maker, what do we do? Because we are still at the situation where living wills are not commonly available. So right now, in my situation, we actually look for a surrogate decision maker. And unfortunately, there is no legislation for that also. So we use convention. This convention also comes from other countries, because in India, there is just no mention of this. From one of the US states, I had downloaded this. The top priority is the court appoints a guardian for you. But typically, the first is the spouse. If your legally married spouse is there, that person has first choice. Then come adult child or majority of available adult children. Then come parents, then come siblings. And finally, if none of these are available, then nearest adult not described above who's related by blood or adoption and is available. So it means at some times we may be just asking the person who's paying the bills. So you can understand that for people who are outside conventional family structures, the appointment of a healthcare power of attorney is crucial. And the Supreme Court has actually authorized us to do this as part of the Advanced Medical Directive. When do you do this? There are trigger events. So a new diagnosis is made. I mean, obviously, if something like cancer is diagnosed, that is really true. Or if somebody who's in their 80s goes into hospital for anything, even a minor illness, and I'm serious about this, that somebody in the 80s is hospitalized for even a simple urinary tract infection. This is something that must begin to be thought about. Or if somebody's care starts becoming, the amount of care that they require goes up. But actually anytime, because as has been said, it always seems too soon until it is too late. So literally anytime. And let me show you how this works out. Now, would it be important for, say, somebody like me? I mean, I have a little bit of low thyroid and cholesterol. Yes, this is because one of the things that I'm really, really afraid of is catastrophic brain injury. Getting a bad stroke, or being in a car accident where my brain is damaged, and I'm not able to give a lecture like this. I don't think I would want to live like that. So let me show you two young men, Barack Obama and Michael Schumacher. Okay. Barack Obama, during his first presidency, in a town hall meeting, told the audience that he and Michelle Obama had made their living wills. Now, why would the US president, at that time he wasn't even 50, why would he do that? Because the US president has the occupational hazard of being shot in the head. What about Michael Schumacher? Well, finished his racing career. He and his family had 500 million pounds in assets. And then he had this really trivial skiing accident where he toppled over and cracked his skull. And 3 years later, he cannot stand or walk unaided after staying months and months in coma. And his family has just spent about 25 million pounds on his care. So I'm not sure how these decisions were made, but obviously, anyway, let's leave that aside. What about anybody else? Well, for the rest of us, as I said, as you cross into your 60s, if any diagnosis is made, you need to be prepared if anything bad suddenly happens. This happened to a patient of mine. I mean, she became a patient because of this. This is a CT scan. And the white stuff that, funny, I mean, this huge thing that you see here is a brain hemorrhage. Okay? Now, this brain hemorrhage, well, it made her paralyzed on the left side. And to save her life, we operated her. After she was operated, in fact, she did quite well. The tubes all came out. And 3 years later, she's dependent. Because this is paralysis on the left side, she can feed herself, she can speak, she can also control her urine and stool. And she doesn't like the situation. And she can speak, so she gives her husband grief. So husband actually told me this. She keeps asking me, why did you do this to me? In fact, even a brother who's a doctor came 3 days later and said, why did you do this? And the most poignant part of it, my daughters live nearby. They have assured me that they will take care of her if I am not there. But right now, I am alone. What if she had a living will? So, and then come people who are older, when you expect that survival is 1 year or less. So if you look at the trajectories that I showed you, those, any one of those, and how do you manage that? In the places, in the countries where these systems work, you have these forms that are filled up. Now, I showed you one form, but this form goes beyond that. It actually is written by a doctor saying, this will be done, this will not be done, this will be done, this will not be done. And it is signed both by the doctor and either the patient or the surrogate, the healthcare power of attorney. And this is a fluorescent color, green, blue, yellow. Different states in the US have different ones. And what to do with these forms? As you can see, these forms have all these details. These forms go everywhere. They go in the patient's records, they go in the electronic health record, but the bright color is because they also come up in the house where they are stuck on the fridge with a fridge magnet. So that if the person is found unconscious and people break the door open and come inside, this is the first thing that they see or they look for. And this has whatever were the wishes that were clearly spelled out by doctor, what is to be done. Does the patient go to hospital at all or not? Does comfort measures, which means you just make sure that the basic things are done, or do they get full treatment? All of that is spelled out so that the emergency team sees this instantly. And as I said, if somebody is conscious and wishes to change their mind, they can change that instantly. They can be revoked orally. Now, again, some pictures, some stories. 3 people in their 90s passed on in 2018. And I'm sure all of you know who I'm talking about. The two Bushes, Barbara Bush in April, Atal Bihari in August, and George Bush in November 2018. Both Barbara and George Bush died in their own beds, surrounded by their family. Literally, they were holding a darbar at the end. How do they manage their last days so smoothly? Because they took charge and their system worked for them. Poor Atal Bihari died alone in an ICU. So what about India and Indians? Now, in 2017, over the period of a year, our Supreme Court passed 3 judgments. Now remember, the preamble to the Constitution gives us equality, liberty, fraternity, justice. The liberty that is spoken about there in the late 40s, early 50s, essentially was political liberty. But that liberty had to be brought into the personal space, and these judgments actually did it. So, privacy, Puttaswamy, health autonomy is the common cause judgment, which I'll speak about, and sexual choice, which is Article 377. And these 3 judgments literally completed this personal autonomy space for us. The only problem out of these 3 judgments, which is the one that I'm concerned about, is the common cause judgment. Unfortunately, it prescribed a procedure. And this procedure, unfortunately, was not in consonance with international best practice. Because they applied it only to terminal illness. So somebody in a situation like Schumacher could not use it. Then they insisted that it had to be signed before a judicial magistrate first class, who's the busiest person in the legal system. Then it goes to the district court, and then it is informed to the family. And there's no mention of enforceability. Remember that judgments are in some ways wishes. You need laws, because it is only laws that prescribe thou shalt not. So you need a law to make this kind of wish enforceable. Because if a doctor refuses to enforce or acknowledge a living will, as of now, this judgment has no answer. So you have to accept in a somewhat uncertain situation. What can you and I do? And I would tell you that the first thing that you can do is start talking. Start talking in your family. A patient's wife, when we discussed this, and the question I asked her, कि आपने और आपके पति ने इसके बारे में बात नहीं करा था? Did you and your husband never talk about this? She said, we never spoke about this. And she started to weep. Everybody is hungry for honest conversations about death, and it is always too early until it is too late. So as far as you're concerned, and these are the instructions that I want you to remember, begin by speaking to those close to you. Choose your surrogates. Confirm that they accept the responsibility, that they understand your wishes, and that they will follow those wishes even if they do not agree with them. And you decide whether they should have any discretion or not. Then you make this advance medical directive or the living will. And I would suggest you try to get it countersigned by a judicial magistrate first class. And I wish you all the best of luck in doing that. Because to my knowledge, only 3 people have done it so far out of 1.2 billion. And all 3 of those people have to be lawyers, who obviously can get to a JMFC much more easily than you and I can. Elsewhere in the world, you require just 1 or 2 witnesses, but it has to be witnessed. There is no attestation that is required. If at all, a notary public will attest it. And I suggest that you go through the rest of the process. If you can't get a JMFC, at least complete the rest of it. Speaking, choosing, writing, signing with witnesses and so on. You do that. Make multiple copies. Inform everybody. So it goes into your medical records. It goes to your power of attorney, the family doctor, on the fridge. Inform everybody who needs to know. Surrogates, family doctor. Take it along for when you're admitted for any procedure. But this is what I absolutely want you to do. And I'll explain why. Because I need your help. Show it to every doctor you consult. 1, you will find out if she or he is willing to accept it and support you. She or he will tell you and find out whether their hospital policy will support it, so that you know where to get admitted in an emergency. And obviously the doctor will know your wishes. Why do I need your help? Because I need your help to make doctors understand how important this is, really. And more importantly, once more and more of you do it, eventually our policymakers will also realize that this is something that is important to many Indian citizens. How did I get involved in this? In 2011, I was part of the medical panel that looked at Aruna Shanbag. A little later, after that, in 2015, I underwent training in advocacy and so on with the American Academy of Neurology. And as I went through that, and actually I went to the training because I had realized that there was something that was missing in my practice. As a physician, I could not really help my patients till the last. And time and again, I was forced to say, ab main kuch nahi kar sakta. Now I know I have undergone some training in palliative care, and I know that I can hold my patient's hand till the very end. But more importantly, it was a personal quest, because as a citizen, I realized I had no control over my own last days. And that was one of the things that drove me into this, because I realized that I needed to do this for myself. So this is a complex situation. It has ethics, it has legislation, it has politics, it has medical economics, it's complex medical decision making. And the problem is, whose responsibility is this? Government, civil society, medical profession, legal profession. So you understand that for this kind of situation where really it is all about individual human suffering, everybody's business is nobody's business. And we realized that somewhere the medical profession had to take some responsibility. So 3 national medical associations came together: the neurologists, the intensivists, those people who take care of who run the ICUs, and the Association of Palliative Care. And we have been working on this. We formed something called ELICIT, the End of Life Care in India Task Force. And I'll close with a quote, and I hope you know who this quote is from. Be the change you wish to see in this world. I'm just going to close. My email ID is here. So is my mobile number, which I would suggest if you need, then you use it strictly by WhatsApp. But as I said, please go to the websites that we gave you earlier, and which we will tell again if you need. And those websites will give you these forms. I'm going to close at this point and ask my fellow panelists to come put their videos on so that we can have a discussion. Yeah. Hi, Dhwani.
Hi, Dr. Ru.
Yeah. And is Sheila there?
Yeah.
Hi, Sheila. Put your video on, I think.
Yeah,
Hi,
I
Rajni.
think
Nice
it's
to see you.
stopped from your end.
Sorry?
Okay, it's come on.
Yeah. Mansi is putting on. So I think if anybody needs my email ID and so on, they would have gotten it by now. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Right. So, right. Over to you.
Okay. So shall we go through some of the questions? I think we've had about 8 or 10 questions that have already come through.
So Rajni or
would you like to take some of the more medically oriented questions now, Ruth, or should we do questions at the end of the entire session, taking the doctor's point of view as well as the legal and procedural points of view together?
Whatever. I am, I think, whatever Dhwani and Sheila want.
See, almost all the questions which are here, the response from our side is that we would take it up in the question and answer session, so we can take them one by one maybe.
Yeah, so they will come up in the, they'll come in a, yeah, so they will come up, Akshat, and we'll just have a, yeah, they'll share the screen. So Akshat will put on his screen, so you'll see this.
The questions we've gone
yeah.
up.
Are they visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what are the latest updates on EOLC policy of India? So end of life care policy of India, I'm sure this is a doctor. So Dhwani, would you like to take that on?
Sure. This is a very complex question to answer because legally speaking, the authority at the moment is the Supreme Court's judgment in Common Cause versus the Union of India, which the court passed in March 2018, last year. And as Dr. Roop mentioned, has several problems with it. The most important of them being the difficulty in operationalizing and giving effect to advanced medical directives in terms of the procedure that the court has prescribed. So very strictly and sort of technically, legally speaking, the procedure laid down in that judgment is what is the law of the land at the moment, at the current moment, as far as both executing an advanced medical directive and getting your doctor or your hospital to implement it goes. But there have been other developments that both, that individuals are taking, as in steps that individuals are taking, that hospitals are implementing, that the ICMR is encouraging, and other interventions that are happening in court as well. So for example, there are two major hospitals, as in the Manipal group of hospitals as well as AIIMS, that have decided to implement an internal end-of-life care policy, which aims to make the process of withholding and withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, both in accordance with an advanced medical directive and for those people who may not have made it. They've tried to make it simpler. Both these are publicly available. The AIIMS guidelines are, in fact, I think they're draft guidelines at the moment, but they are available on their website to view. Second, the Indian Council of Medical Research has also taken the initiative to encourage medical practitioners and clinical establishments to put in place a system for implementing do not resuscitate orders. So again, a way in which doctors can take a call, again in consultation with patients, about when medical treatment might be futile and how that decision can be recorded and preserved to guide medical decisions should a situation like that arise. And finally, on the legal front, the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, whom Vidhi has assisted in drafting an application, has filed a petition in court. I mean, technically speaking, an application to clarify the court's earlier judgment, asking for a modification of the procedure that the court laid down. So currently that petition is pending. Obviously it can't be heard in this in the current climate, but the state at which it's at is that the Health Ministry has agreed to sit down with relevant stakeholders to work out a process for simplifying the procedure that the Common Cause judgment lays down. And finally, again, Vidhi and in the End of Life Care in India Task Force have drafted a model law, which is again available on the Vidhi website, which tries to simplify the procedure that the court lays down. And I mean, obviously, it's just a model law. It's not currently implemented by anyone. But the idea is to start a conversation about the kind of legal framework that we wish to have. And this is a law that is open to be taken up by any state government or central government to be enacted. So that's the status at which the EOLC sort of legal advocacy is at currently in India.
Just a quick question, Dhwani.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always surprised by why a state government would not take this up and do something about it.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
I don't think it's a question of state governments worrying whether they have legislative competence over this or not, because clearly they do. Health is a subject that they can legislate on. And even if one considers that this is a subject that relates to medical professionals, that is also a subject that they have the power to legislate on. I only suppose that, I mean, and this I think applies both to state and central governments. This is an issue about which there is political inertia, really, as in there is no real no one has identified this as a problem. Perhaps the medical fraternity has not made it clear to state health authorities the kind of burden that the absence of a legal framework poses, both in, and this is a burden that will be posed both in financial and professional and emotional terms. So maybe maybe we need to quantify the kind of, if numbers are the only thing that really works with government, then we need to quantify the kind of harm that the absence of a legal framework like this poses. And I don't know, I think the more powerful body that the government listens to, as is clear with the COVID pandemic, where, the only central ordinance we have is one that criminalizes violence against healthcare personnel. Healthcare workers are a body that the government listens to. And if the medical fraternity is able to sort of organize and present the lack of a legal framework as a problem that affects their daily practice, then again, maybe we might see state governments taking a more proactive role.
I had a slightly different take. Okay. I believe that any state or even the central government that has not provided good health care can't really provide a death law. It's not going to risk its political credibility by doing that before doing the first.
Fair enough, yeah.
Anyway.
If I may just ask, there are some questions that we're observing which seem to be sort of clubbed in themes and things like that.
Sure.
Should
we can go through them together? I think I'll just put some of the living will questions first. There's specific clarifications on the living will.
Yeah.
So I'll try to put them together now. So I think I'll just go through some. Yeah.
Did Sheila have anything to suggest to that earlier discussion? Sheila? We kind of...
Could I give my points after the questions?
Okay.
I have one or two.
Okay, sure. How do we make a living will?
Yeah, I'll just go through some now. So how do we make a living will? Is the living will required to be registered with 2 signatures? Do we have a draft living will? So these 3, and then we can go through some specific living will questions that have come in the end now during the discussion. So
sure.
Okay. So Dhwani, I think this one is...
Sure. As in the how do we make a living will one, I think Dr. Roop through his talk has already described the sort of process that we should follow in thinking about the kind of will that we want to draft. So I'll address only the sort of legal procedure for making a will. And as I said, the latest authority on that is, the relevant authority is what the Supreme Court guidelines say about how you make a will. So this has to be a will that's made by an adult person who is of sound mind. So, which, to put it differently, is someone who has decision-making capacity, can take decisions about their healthcare. And it has to be made in the presence of 2 witnesses. The court calls these witnesses, recommends that these witnesses preferably be independent, but it's unclear what that means. You could argue that any family member who is a witness is not an independent one, because they obviously have some interest in how you decide to, how you choose to have a good death. So I think it's perfectly fine for family members to act as witnesses. In fact, it's probably recommended. And the final condition is that this will has to be countersigned by a judicial magistrate of the first class. So this is really the only, this is the sort of onerous requirement that the current guidelines impose. So I think this addresses, so it doesn't have to be registered in the sense in which we register wills that we make for disposing of property after death. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to go to follow the procedure under the Indian Registration Act. But yes, you are required to go before a judicial authority like who the court has designated as the judicial magistrate. And as far as the draft living will for Indians goes, again, Dr. Roop has sort of shown sample copies of this. We don't have an official legally sanctioned draft will, but that's not necessary. It could take any form that you choose it to take, provided that it meets the procedural conditions I just described. And this draft will be available on the websites that Dr. Roop mentioned as well.
Just
Yeah.
a quick point to add to that.
Yeah.
I mean, we get a little stuck on this, that what happens if I make it and I don't have it signed by a judicial magistrate?
That's right.
Class?
Yeah.
It's still important. I mean, having that paper will help your family to make decisions. It will help your doctors. And as I said, if you work on the system yourself, then even that document, even though it doesn't have a judicial magistrate first class signing on it, it still has weight.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, the next question was exactly about that. Is the authorization, it's not a legal document, is an email or a letter enough?
Yeah, I think the thing to ask ourselves here first is, what does it mean for something in this context to be a legal document? And the way I would put it is that this is something that imposes an enforceable obligation on another person. So ideally, if a medical practitioner were to refuse to implement a legally valid advanced medical directive, then you would want to hold them to account, or to take them to a judicial forum to ensure that that directive is actually implemented. But I think thinking about something like this in terms of enforceability in this sort of very narrow litigious sense is not useful for a discussion on advanced directives. So the idea really behind having a legal document is to, as I see it, a way to give medical practitioners the confidence to take wishes like these into account, and to not be worried about taking decisions that are conducive to dying with dignity and that allow them to act ethically and in the best interests of their patients. So yes, technically a doctor might be entitled to say, okay, this is a letter, an email, this hasn't been executed in the way in which the Supreme Court guidelines state. I'm going to ignore this completely. But that might not necessarily be the ethical thing to do, especially if the doctor has had the chance to have conversations with the patient about issues like this before and knows that this is something that they might prefer. Because the spirit of the court's judgment really is that you respect a person's right to die with dignity, and that right is expressed through the wishes of that person. Now, it's only recommended a legal form for those wishes to be expressed in, but that doesn't mean that the wishes themselves have no standing, or that the doctor shouldn't take them into account in any case as a valid metric in deciding how to take a decision about end of life care.
And for any doctors who are listening, remember, in the West, the bulk of the legal action on end of life care issues has been against doctors who have specifically not followed
exactly
the living will. That's the biggest legal threat to doctors in the West.
Yeah, so the next question was also on this, whether a doctor can legally...
Yeah, so whether a doctor can take into account a non-legally valid will, as in, yes, they can. There is nothing to stop them from doing so. It's just another factor that helps them determine what the wishes of the patient are. But obviously, the advice here would be, again, to doctors who might be worried about, actions for medical malpractice, is to not implement something like this if there is evidence of disagreement within as in stark disagreement within the family, or refusal, as in a desire not to have something like this implemented, because that then lays the groundwork for potential legal action. But for all, as in for the majority of cases where there might be consensus on something like this, I don't think anyone would hold a doctor liable for taking an instrument like this into account, even if it were not validly legally executed.
So, Sheila, do you want to come in a little?
Yeah, one thing is, most of our patients, that most of our patients, when they come to a hospital, if they don't have something written down, but maybe they could have orally told their families. So can the hospital not take, like we have a general consent form, can they not sign and say that these are the things our patient might want? The patient may or may not have given it in writing, but orally they may have told their families, or the family might know that this is what a patient wants. In such a case, what does the doctor do or the hospital do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good way of trying to sort of get around the onerous requirements of executing this directive, and this, I think, for example, recording these preferences once a patient is admitted to hospital would be in the nature of the sort of the POLST orders that that Dr. Roop mentioned in his talk. So it would be a sort of guidance for doctors themselves on the kind of treatment that they should be providing the patient. And perhaps we could, as in again, if I had to make a very technical legal argument, perhaps we could distinguish those kinds of orders from an actual advance directive, which would mean that or DNR orders or POLST instruments.
For DNR, we used to have it in our hospital. I don't
Right.
know if it still is there.
Right.
But we could include, because many of the patients may not write it down. They may have
Exactly.
orally expressed.
That's absolutely fine. As in any oral expression of the patient's wishes that is then recorded should be counted as legally valid, because as long as the patient has the, and for example, especially if the patient has the ability at that time to communicate what
Yes
they
or no.
desire or they don't, then that, in fact, there's an obligation then to respect those wishes.
Which means the hospital forms should have this paragraph or a form which can be filled in last minute.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be a very good practice.
In fact, if the POLST form, I mean, the one version of the POLST form is there in both the AIIMS and the Manipal documents.
Right.
Yeah. So we
Okay,
have some specific, sorry, go. Yeah.
Good.
We have some specific questions on wills only. So maybe I'll just finish all the questions on how to draft a will, and then we can go to the broader questions. And
okay,
we just came right now. So suppose we get an AMD signed by a JMFC and then our wishes change. Do we need to again get the AMD to sign the signed by the JMFC?
I suppose.
So if you've decided not to, I mean, if you've decided to revoke that will, then ideally an oral revocation should work. But again, as good practice, you should try, I mean, it would be best to destroy the document that you've made physically to avoid confusion at a later date. But if you wanted to amend it, then yes, although the court doesn't say anything specifically about altering or amending a directive, I would imagine that it would have to follow the same process.
It would have to be a new will.
Yeah.
Then is a doctor in India obliged to honor the living will if patient's relatives are unaware of it and if it is not signed by a JMFC?
See, again, if it's not signed by a JMFC, the doctor does have the opportunity to say that, yes, this is not a legally executed directive and that therefore there is no binding obligation to observe it. As far as patients, I mean, the patient's family and relatives being unaware, again, as a matter of law, that should not matter. It's the advance directive is considered the expression of the patient's wishes to or desire to refuse treatment, and that is what should be respected, irrespective of what the family might desire. But again, as good practice, it might be better to involve the family in that kind of conversation. Again, not with a view to necessarily getting their consent for implementing the directive, but to make them aware that this directive exists, and this is the process that the doctor will accordingly be observing.
If I may just elaborate a little bit on that, and maybe Roop, you can help me with this. In situations like this, where a patient has expressed a wish in a document, but it's not legally binding because it's not signed, registered, that document acts as a foundation, a background for us to conduct our conversations and discussions with the family, keeping in mind that this was the patient's expressed wish. It helps the relatives and the family members who are in a difficult moment, even if they have been unaware of the patient's wishes, to use that as the background, as the foundation of how they will decide going forward. Now, if there's no conflict between family members on this, the doctors can follow this, ideally with some independent doctor not directly taking care of the patient also being involved. Like maybe if the hospital has an ethics committee, if they don't, you can institute something like that and then still work on limitation of life-sustaining treatment. It wouldn't be legally binding, but we do allow surrogates to make decisions even without a living will. So it would follow that. It's just that this document is a framework. It helps us to figure out what the patient's wishes were.
Exactly.
Another question, can hospitals refuse to remove ventilator on the plea that it would amount to killing the patient even if a living will is present?
No. Oh, sorry. Dr. Roof, do you want
No,
to?
no. Okay, I'll answer it. So there is about the only case, and Dhwani actually pointed this out, is one in which a hospital in Delhi kept a person who was effectively brain dead on the ventilator, and the consumer court forced that hospital to pay compensation to the family. So doctors, hospitals use this excuse that there is no law. So no law doesn't mean that you do something that is unethical. I mean, you have to do what is ethically right, and you have to document it. You have to see that it's not done just by one doctor acting alone. Preferably, it should be a panel of 3 doctors at least. And the hospital should have a system of looking at these decisions once they are taken. So that once the 3 doctors have kind of agreed, maybe at some later date, the hospital administration can look at this decision and say, okay, they did the right things in the right order. So it's okay. Now, that kind of a process, every hospital has to set up. Just because they have not set up the process, they can't use the excuse that there is no law. Dhwani?
That's right. Exactly. I mean, because again, the crux of the Supreme Court's judgment is that you have a right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, and that this is an expression of your right to die with dignity. So it's that spirit of the court's judgment that needs to be honored, and not getting away on technicalities. So you, as in again, if you are able, sorry, yeah, Sheila.
Just one point. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
No.
But if a patient is brain dead and the ventilator is removed, is different. But what if the patient is not brain dead, is on a ventilator, and the family says discontinue? Would that be okay? Because then when you remove the ventilator, you are literally removing the breathing.
So
yes.
Again, if we were to go strictly by what the Supreme Court says about the conditions under which life-sustaining treatment can be removed, these are when the patient is terminally ill or has no hope of cure or recovery or has lost all consciousness. But ideally, as in the way in which this sort of decision should be taken is by determining whether, and Dr. Roop can elaborate on this, on whether continuing that life-sustaining treatment is potentially beneficial or not for the patient.
So this is a question that we term medical futility. Okay. So you don't have to wait literally till the body rots on the ventilator, till the heart finally stops. Way before that, if you judge that there is going to be no decent outcome from this, if there is no disagreement between the family and the doctors on this, and typically the way, for instance, we do it at Hinduja is that it needs at least 3 consultants to jointly confirm that they all agree that this is the situation. We then want consensus with the family, and there again, if within the family there is no consensus, then typically we don't take this any further. But if there is consensus on both sides, treating team and the family, and that is the case in almost 90% of cases, then frankly, at least at Hinduja Hospital, the administration usually has no problem with this. And I think this should be the way it should go in any decent hospital system. Sheila, does that answer your question, or is that?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Sheila, also, if I may just add one more point here. The one thing that should be addressed when we are planning to withdraw life-sustaining treatment like a ventilator is that even if the person has no hope for recovery, but we must make sure that all palliative measures are taken for alleviation of any breathlessness or suffering that happens during the withdrawal process from a ventilator. So the hospitals should also have policies for when you plan for withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments like dialysis or ventilators. It should also be accompanied by measures to alleviate any kind of pain and suffering that happens along with that, because the goal here for the patient and the family both is reducing suffering, which is only going to prolong, reducing a measure which is, or stopping a measure which is only going to prolong suffering and prolong this process of death and not add any. So you have to take care of the suffering aspect as well.
So Sheila, do you want to ask about discharge against medical advice? I think you're leading to that.
Yeah, there have been a couple of cases even in the recent past. One was a patient who actually probably had died on the table, but the patient's family, this was in a large hospital, and the patient's family was not told. They guessed it later. The patient was put on ventilator, and then the family realized it and told them discontinue everything. That did not happen. Now, if a patient has to be taken home, quite often it's the doctor's team that says no. Firstly, they say it'll hasten death, and that is scary for the family because they don't really want to put the patient down. Secondly, a lot of patients, families don't understand palliative care. They feel it's like giving an aspirin, or it's like giving a small painkiller. They don't realize that it is a technically difficult thing to do. And that is when the doctor says you can't take the patient home because you'll not be able to deal with it at home.
So typically, say for instance, in Hinduja, when we, like Rajni was saying, that when we disconnect, when we reduce therapies, we sometimes you disconnect the ventilator and the patient passes away immediately in the ICU in the next few hours. Sometimes they survive for longer periods of time. But whether this period is short or long, it is our responsibility as medical professionals to make sure that the patient and the family do not suffer during this period. And when some hospitals literally say discharge against medical advice, it's literally throwing the patient out at this stage. That is terrible. That is just wrong, unethical, illegal. I don't know how much negatives to use about that.
Exactly.
Because you have to help them at that last period, see that the family, and more importantly, this is a valid decision. Very often doctors put this on the family, ki tumne kara, you said it, that is why. Yeah. Which is wrong. This is a medical decision. This is not something to be put on the family's door. We have to see that they understand that they are not guilty. It is something that is medical.
And in fact,
how does the lay, sorry.
No, sorry, I was just going to add that, in fact, even as in last year's tragic case involving a young girl in Delhi who died of dengue, a government panel that was appointed by the Haryana government to look into this issue, as in commented on the illegality of allowing a person of withdrawing someone from a ventilator and then allowing them to die without support care in an ambulance. So the panel itself said that kind of practice would be equivalent to being medically negligent.
Well, a lay person like me, I would ask the question, how long will it take? Will my patient survive for 15 days or 2 days or 12 days or whatever? And the doctor says we don't know. So then we're not sure whether we should take the patient home or not. In such a case, we do depend on what the doctor is going to tell us.
So, Rajni, you want to answer that? Yeah, Rajni.
Sure. It also brings up a question that someone had posed earlier. I think it was Tanuja Agarwal, who's one of the people on the participants. If doctors can predict, will they not become messengers of doom, was her question. And there was a concern about the moralistic misuse of power. So two very important things. One is, Roop mentioned about diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. Diagnosis and treatment part we are good at. Prognosis, the crystal ball gazing, is something that we're not very good at. And depending on all the
prognosis is, many people won't know what prognosis means.
Prognosis is being able to foresee or foretell the future, which is what Roop had mentioned in his talk. Depending on the underlying medical conditions, the time is very variable. So it depends on all the other organ system complexity that is there. If it's a purely neurological condition, or purely cardiac, purely respiratory,
so Rajni,
or how we see nowadays, a lot more, it's a very variable time.
So Rajni, can I come in on this? You are a pulmonologist. Sure. You're an experienced ICU doctor. Okay. Do you think that if you wear this hat of not diagnosing, not treating, but doing prognosis, you're fairly confident of your abilities?
I would say I'm fairly confident of my abilities, but Roop, you know as well as I that with some cases in neurology and like how I see in pulmonology, maybe 2 out of 10 times we're not accurate on it. We think somebody is not going to make it, and they do. And
Again, if we say, because families seem to understand this as if I say that I can't tell you, but I can tell you that this patient is not going to survive more than 2 months. Or 3 months.
Absolutely.
Or 2
so
years.
to that extent,
that we can tell you.
Where you mentioned about the surprise question and all the indicators, that's there. And we are people who discuss that with our patients on a regular basis. And this is something I actually revisit with my patients with advanced chronic diseases almost on a 6-monthly level, that we need to set goals and figure out how this is going to be. So I don't think I'm actually a messenger of doom, just to answer that question. It's actually a very relieving thing for the family to be able to discuss it. I usually invite family members to be part of that discussion. And this is the big elephant in the room nobody's talking about. Somebody's been admitted to the ICU 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. We need to address these questions and what would they want. And, it actually becomes a very emotional bonding moment between the patient, their entire family, and the doctor as part of that unit which is working together for the patient. So I don't think I'm a messenger of doom at all. In fact, I'm a messenger of comfort at that point.
Yeah, so I actually put it in a certain way. I say that when I know that Yamdut is coming, I don't beckon him. I don't even open the door for him. But when he comes in, I complete the handover with grace and dignity.
Absolutely.
More importantly, well before Yamdut enters, I want to assure my patient that I will be with them till the end.
Absolutely.
And you can't do that unless you speak about these things.
I'm going to use a quote from Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers was this television personality who ran a show for children in the US for the longest time, for decades. And he could talk about things with children as young as 8 years old, about death, divorce, disasters, discrimination, just about anything under the sun. And he has this quote where he says, it's basically, to die is to be human. This isn't about saying something that's not going to happen to any of us. To die is to be human. Anything that is human is mentionable. And anything that is mentionable is manageable. So what we end up doing with these conversations with our patients is actually about making the whole process more manageable for the entire family unit. And as soon as you learn that, then it's not about a moralistic use of power. It's actually about empowering the patient and empowering the family. This is not about power in the hands of medical professionals. It's actually about power in the hands of patients and their family.
So we are actually at the end of our time, but we have this meeting space for another sometime.
I think we have a couple of very important questions that I think should be addressed, because we have a lot of listeners. There were questions regarding feeding. So there was a question about, can an 88-year-old comatose person who is on Ryle's tube feeds for 8 years, what about the decision to discontinue feeding? Another question was about somebody who lacks decisional capacity, somebody who is physically very well but has no mental capacity for decision making. What about discontinuation of medications? This brings back all the Terry Schiavo kind of ethical dilemmas. So would Roop, Dhwani, Sheila, any of you want to take those issues? One is about feeding, a continuation of life-sustaining treatments. There was also a question about, what if I withdraw my life-sustaining treatment? I have an advance directive, I have a living will, and I say I want withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. But following that, I don't die and I stay on in a persistent vegetative state. I know for a fact that with my own uncle, the process of stopping feeding and IV fluids in any kind of, it took us 18-21 days. So it can be a very long process, but this issue about feeding, if someone could address.
Okay, so Sheila, do you want to give us the patient and caregiver's perspective before I answer it medically?
Very
What do you
difficult to
think?
take that decision for an outsider, but I think there have been doctors whom I know who had looked after their parents in hospital and who had decided against putting in any tubes, not even the Ryle's tube, no feeding by tube. So it was a difficult decision. The patients were aware and conscious, and it worked. So I think that would be a very individual thing, because some of them say the feeding should be there, but don't do anything other invasive thing, like don't put him on the ventilator, but give him the feed. So that's
Yeah.
also there. Some people say, okay, give the insulin, but don't do dialysis. So that is a thing you have to leave to them. One question over here is, if the patient is in great pain, but the doctor feels that any more morphine would be dangerous.
Um,
So,
yeah. So
no, just legally speaking, as in the administration of morphine purely for pain relief purposes, even with the knowledge that perhaps that might hasten death, is not something that would be legally prohibited. So it would be recognized as valid medical treatment that you would be able to give such a person.
So that is actually called the doctrine of double effect. So if you are relieving suffering, but as part of
Okay.
relieving suffering, you actually cause death. Your primary aim was to relieve suffering. And worldwide, that is accepted. That if you are relieving suffering and as part of relieving suffering, the patient, the breathing goes down and the morphine, yeah, that's acceptable. So that's the reason why when a doctor asks that question, you have to tell them, please call in palliative care. They know how to handle these situations. They know how to talk to families and to make these decisions right. I'll come back.
There are some, sorry, there's some questions
Yeah.
where can nurses be involved in this? And one input from me is, I think nurses should be involved in this, but also we should involve a lot of religious heads, because they wield a lot of influence, and I don't see them being involved in these discussions.
So I think as far as religious organizations are concerned, I mean, for the Christian community, the Catholic Church does have fairly clear positions on this, and they do come in to help in a fair way. I think part of the problem for Hindus is that we don't have a clergy, people that can be called in to do this. And we've been trying to work with various of the orders, say for instance, I mean, I wouldn't want to name them, but trying to see if they start taking up this responsibility. So far it has not happened. Can I come back to that question about the feeding tube and feeding?
Yes.
So partly this goes back to Dhwani also. If you have to pull out the feeding tube or stop feeding somebody who is, say, vegetative, because that was what you asked, it's actually not very easy. Not for the family, not for the doctor, not for the nurse, nobody, because the person starves and dehydrates to death. So it's not an easy situation. So you want to try and tackle it in other ways. Even if you remember Aruna Shanbag, at the end she died of respiratory infection. They didn't stop her feeding.
Yeah.
What about the other way around? The Santhara decision. What if an awake individual says, enough, I'm now going to stop eating and drinking? Vani, you want to answer that?
So the Supreme Court has now upheld that. So initially the Rajasthan High Court ruled that practice was not permissible. The Supreme Court reversed that. The only thing is that was obviously recognized as an expression of the right to practice your religion. So the manifestation of this was as a form of exercising your religious rights.
So I'm not Jain.
Sure, but so your voluntarily giving up eating or drinking is now no longer considered a criminally punishable act of suicide, because the very act of suicide itself is now, given the Mental Health Care Act that was enacted in 2017, there is a there is a bar on prosecution against of a person who has attempted suicide, by recognizing the fact that this is probably an expression of some other underlying conditions and not necessarily and is not an act to be punished per se.
Okay.
So I don't think there would be any legal consequences to deciding to voluntarily give up eating or drinking.
We haven't covered misuse of advanced directives.
Oh, there was a question about collusion that someone had posed about the possibility of collusion between family members to get rid of the responsibility of care of an elder, and how anybody would one of you want to address how we would safeguard against that the patient's interests are kept in mind and protected and not misused by collusion by family members.
That's something that the legal system seems to be terribly worried about. It's misuse. I mean, they are not bothered about no use.
I have to say, honestly, in practice, it's in so many years, and Roop, you can help me with this. I can probably remember 1 or 2 instances where I wondered if the family had something else on their mind. But the majority of decisions, and we've taken care of plenty of patients in ICUs with advanced diseases, have always been about what's in the patient's best interest. And it seems like we're more bothered about. So I don't know. Setting up protections and safeguards should not be a hindrance to actually allowing good care, which is what is happening right now.
Exactly. And I mean, you can argue that there are enough safeguards in the form of having an independent panel of doctors assess whether the continuation of treatment would be futile or not. I mean, of course, the court's judgment has far too many hoops for that. But again, the suggestion that the End of Life Care in India Task Force has made, that you have an ethics committee at the hospital that does a monthly audit of decisions that are taken like this in order to uncover any irregularities. These should be sufficient to at least safeguard that process. Other than that, I think the problem is a bit deeper, right? I think these worries about misuse come from some deeper deficit of trust that exists between doctors and patients. And so I think the answer to that doesn't really lie in having legal safeguards. So there's a lot more communication and I don't know, there's lots more conversations that need to be
Sheila,
had about that.
What do you want to say about that trust bit, Sheila?
The trust between the doctor and the patient?
Yeah, because Dhwani is flagging that as the main reason for this worry about misuse.
Well, actually, for my personal thing, I would actually go by what the doctor says. And yeah, 1 minute, there's a question here.
I have a question which was
you can involve people who are not relatives also. So that way this thing of misuse would become less. Immediate relatives whom the patient trusts. If you've been treating a patient for a while and you know that the patient trusts, let's say a family doctor or a neighbor, you could take that person in confidence if you have a doubt that the close family members are misusing something.
Yeah, so, but that is, good practice from when you end up going through these decisions. Never should it be taken by one person alone. So one doctor and one relative, no way. It is not okay. Ideally, if there is no advance medical directive, then it is 3 doctors. And in the family side, I would say, I mean, we usually have the spouse and the children or siblings. We see that they are all on the same page. Then I don't think there is any, we've never run into this problem of feeling that the family wanted to get rid of somebody. That doesn't happen.
And that's why it might be good practice to actually make a directive that appoints someone as your surrogate or healthcare power of attorney, because then that's one way to make it clear who is the person you trust and who you want to be, who you would like to be consulted.
There was some link question.
I want to bring up
that I'd like to bring up, if I may. there were two questions. One was about a systemic shift that's needed, and that was Olinda Timms, and she mentioned that shouldn't we be working towards ensuring that hospitals have policies in place regarding living wills, regarding ethics committees, and decision making for the end of life.
We are
So should
working
we
on
be
that.
working for, I know, so I just wanted to make sure that that issue is
Absolutely.
addressed about the work that's going on for that.
Yeah.
The
Exactly.
second was about again coming to this issue of which relative, and when the patient's wishes are not really respected. If someone has a living will, but the immediate next of kin chooses to override that, if this is a conflict situation, or say for example a patient wants a peaceful non-interventional approach and the son is pushing for aggressive care, and how would one handle that situation? So two completely different things, but those are two questions that I saw on the
So,
And the linked question is, well, what if the surrogate dies, and what do you do after that?
what if the surrogate dies? That was another interesting one. The
Yeah,
surrogate.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
so I mean, I would put it this way, that's why you need not one but three surrogates. It's ideal. I mean, best practice is to have three. And the question about that again, if there is a clear living will, it actually specifies how much discretion the surrogate has. So there will be living wills where the surrogate only has the authority to see that the patient's wishes are followed. And there is one where the surrogate has decision-making authority, meaning he talks to the doctors and makes the decisions. And that really flows to an individual's choices. Do I authorize somebody and trust somebody, or do I make my own decisions and I put them down? Which is where this whole bit about talking through this and writing it down properly, all that becomes important.
About the hospitals bit, do you want to speak about that a little bit, Rupa and Twani, about the measures being taken to make sure all hospitals have policies about living wills and
So
ethics?
the draft policies for Manipal and AIIMS, Manipal is already published.
Yeah.
That's called the Blue Maple document. We were involved with that. The AIIMS document, Dhwani has been involved with.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, it's still taking some time to come out, but I think that's also largely on the same lines.
Yeah.
They're both modern documents. I mean, they're pretty much, they should be good once they are out.
Someone has asked a question about organ donation, though it's not directly related, but maybe you can touch upon it.
What's the question?
Yes, it is.
So organ donation, see, one situation is very clear that if somebody has asked that her organs be taken, you have to follow something called the dead donor rule. So if the person who has offered organs for donation is brain dead, then we take that as death and organs can be removed. The problem is if that person had said that I do not want to survive in a horrible shape and I want you to disconnect the ventilator, but does not satisfy the technical criteria of brain death. Now understand that you're withdrawing the ventilator. I mean, you're following the person's wishes, but that person is not brain dead. In India, at this moment, unfortunately, we can follow the patient's wishes, but we can't take the organs. In those countries where all these things have evolved, where these decisions have evolved, you have something called donation after cardiac death. So in that situation, what happens is, if you are disconnecting the ventilator, you take the patient down to the operation theater, the ventilator is removed, and you wait. If the person starts to breathe on their own, if the heart starts to function normally, then so be it. But if the ventilator is withdrawn and after some time the heart stops, which happens almost in 70 to 80% of times, but in some patients it doesn't happen. In 70 to 80% of times, then after a certain period of time, after the heart has stopped, so you wait for about 2, 3, some countries say even up to 5 minutes, but typically 3 minutes, then we take it that the person has finally died. And then the dead donor rule is fulfilled. And then what is called the organ harvest team then goes in quickly to start to remove the organs. And with this, it's called donation after cardiac death. Kidneys seem to come out fairly well, but people are doing better and better at this. But then obviously, this is a process that requires the individual concerned and the family to have thought about it. It requires a legal system that accepts this, a medical system that understands how to work this somewhat complicated process. So for India, I think that's still about 20 years away.
Yeah, and I think this Nilima Safekar's question was about whether this desire to donate organs should be expressed in a living will or not. I think it's better to follow the form under the Transplantation of Human Organs and Tissues Act, given that that is a well-established process that's currently functioning, and not the living will, which again, as we've seen, has problems in actually executing.
But you can put both together and
You
sign
can.
both together.
Sure, but specifically if you want your wishes about organ donation to be respected, it might be just easier to follow the form that the Transplantation Act prescribes.
There's one more question, which is that the living will that we have mentioned is only for adults. What happens in the case of minors, somebody who's under, say, 14 or 10? Can the parents take that decision? Little born babies, parents can, but what about a child who's older?
Yeah, so again, I think the decision would have to be, as in one, there are guidelines both for adults and so by extension for children about what decisions should be taken about life-sustaining treatment if an advance directive has not been executed. And again, there's a procedure, of course, that the court has prescribed, which involves several layers of committees and a judicial magistrate coming into the picture. But going by the process that, again, the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine and the Indian Association of Palliative Care recommend, the procedure you would follow here, one is have an independent team of doctors assess whether treatment would be futile or not in such a scenario, and then conduct a process of shared decision-making with the next of kin or family to arrive at some consensus on whether that treatment should be removed. So I would imagine that this would apply both for adults and for children. And for children, you would assume that the next of kin would be the parents, or if not available, the legal guardians.
Right. So we are 20 minutes over time. We still
There
have
are still quite a lot of questions. Yeah.
So there was a couple of questions more. Do we still have a little more time, Roop?
Yeah, 6. I think we actually have to close it at 6. So
Okay.
And perhaps if we will try and, I mean, maybe if there's some forum, we can try and post answers to some of these questions on Twitter using some of our handles if we are unable to address them all right now.
So what I suggest, Akshat and Rajni, if you can at least copy paste all of these.
Yeah.
And then we can, it's useful because we address them in future lectures or whatever.
Yeah.
Depending on what.
There was one question which is about someone has expressed their wishes that everything must be done to save their life. In such a case, what do you do if you see the patient is suffering, but the treatment to relieve pain may hasten death? Would you want to take that, Roop, or should I?
Why don't you answer?
So usually what ends up happening is that this, I think, the question does not state whether the patient at that point is the one who's making decisions versus a healthcare proxy. If the patient is awake, conscious, and able to have a conversation, then I can have the conversation with them and find out what their preferences, what their goals of care are. If the goals of care are relieving pain, then we have to have the discussion about this may hasten the process of death. And then it's the choice. Patient autonomy remains the most important ethical principle to follow. Then it's a choice for the patient, and I'll do everything in my power to find some pain relieving modality which will not hasten death. However, if they choose that they do not want suffering, the patient needs to understand that. Similarly with the healthcare proxy, if the patient does not have a living will in place, then then the healthcare proxy is the one who if they are the decision-making person, then they need to understand that certain therapeutic interventions come with pain, which if not relieved, I mean the way of administering pain relief may hasten the process of death. So this is more about informed consent. This is more about autonomy. And when it comes to palliative care, we don't, if once we are all on the same page that relief of pain is the goal, we know that morphine, fentanyl, opioids can hasten the process of death, but our titration of the medication dose is to achieve the objective of pain relief. The secondary outcome of respiratory depression is not what we are looking at. We accept that as a known secondary outcome. But the primary goal must be met, which is relief of pain and suffering.
Yeah,
So
but
that's
finally the patient decides. I mean, the patient,
it's
ideally
autonomy.
the patient decides. Okay. Akshat?
There were a bunch of questions on role of nurses. What role can nurses play in palliative care, and can they influence patients to draft living wills? And generally, a couple of questions on what nurses.
So palliative care. Remember that when palliative care actually moves out and becomes teams that provide palliative care, typically these are nurse-led teams, because much of this work is actually done by nurses. It's doctors are ideally should not be, there are many things that nurses can and should finish, and doctors should not be required in a lot of palliative care work.
I think the counseling for the process for a living will can also be done
By
by
nurses.
nurses who are involved in palliative care. It's a different matter that the actual process requires the doctor to be involved in it. But you know, these things are never done as one conversation, one sitting. Coming to the actual making of a living will for a patient, or even having a discussion, even if it's not a legal document, even just having this discussion is always something that's done over multiple sittings, sometimes with the patient, sometimes the patient and family member. So nurses can play a large role in this situation, especially when we look at long-term care. Nurses do play a major role in helping families understand what the future might look like.
In fact, if we take it away from doctors, we are likely to get
Much better success.
yeah.
Nurses spend a lot more time with patients. They really know the stories. They know the family dynamics much better too, I think.
Yeah. Anyway.
There was one question on, is it practical for the poor? As in, seems like a process only the rich can afford. So what happens to the poor who can't afford treatment in any case, and what do we do about it?
If I may just address one point on that question, I think autonomy is given to everybody. Financial considerations for treatment have always been one of the greatest problems with injustice in healthcare delivery in India. That's a huge drawback of our system. But I do believe that choice can be given to all.
Sheila, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, actually, this is like asking whether, you know, does this apply to the poor? Well, yes, it does. But will it happen in practice? Probably not, because this does involve a hospital setting, a tertiary care setting. This does not involve somebody who's living in the village at home, where you don't have access to aggressive treatment. Like I live in a village, and it's not likely that they would take an elderly person to a tertiary care hospital at all. So the question of invasive treatments don't come up here.
Okay, yeah, I'd just like to share one story, if I may.
Yeah.
Which will kind of illustrate this. I had a patient with a very invasive fungal infection, an uncontrolled diabetic with an invasive fungal infection, which was invading through his sinuses up into, you know, the bones of his orbit towards his eye. Really difficult situation. Middle-aged gentleman, wonderful wife and son. And he needed this long-term antifungal therapy, which was really, really expensive. And we tried everything possible with help from social workers, crowdfunding. And it just came to a point when he and his wife both sat together and said that, tell me how many more months do we have to keep doing this? Because we finished the standard course of therapy. 2 months later, things were back again. And he says, I don't see this getting better. He'd lost the vision in one eye already. And the decision was taken. This is a poor family, okay? And the decision was taken by him and his wife jointly that they were going to refuse any further treatment that we were offering. And it was taken because they said that I am still suffering. You can't give me a way out of this. This is now gone to a point where I'm going to have some kind of surgery where half of my skull is to be operated on. You still can't guarantee anything. So I do think these choices are given. We give these counseling. It's not always, and this was repeated levels of counseling until the time that we could find funding for them. Every time we would have these conversations. And finally, in the end, they took a decision saying we don't want any further treatment. Yes, it was a financial consideration, but the decision, the autonomy was given.
Yeah. So, last couple of minutes.
There's one question here. This is specifically for you, Dr. Roop. Please answer. What if after the living will some technological advancement takes place which has higher survival rate, but which has been specifically excluded in the living will?
So, ideally, I mean, if the person is completely aware of what the chances are and has thought about it and then decided that they don't want it, that's their choice. I mean, I cannot force a person to live on the ventilator for the next 5 years or whatever. It's a choice that they make. Or if it is not a ventilator, if it is a treatment which is potentially coming up and so on. Yeah, but there are times when people, say in the late 70s, 80s, people choose not to treat something that would normally be easily treatable. They say, no, I won't go to hospital. I don't even want treatment for pneumonia. Let me go.
And
if I may, there's, even if we think of it as something that's come up later, I might have made a living will now, which said that do not do these particular treatments. And 5 years from now, something comes up. If the person is conscious, you have the option to change it.
You ask them. You always ask them.
That can be revised.
And you ask them, no?
Yeah. I think that these are things that we revisit with patients again and again. Does this still hold good? Anytime there is a deterioration in patients with chronic illnesses, I will have these conversations, make one baseline determination. We'll come to some agreement. Every time they have a dip, you remember the conversation we had 3 months ago? Are we still on the same line of thinking? Have your views changed? So that's something you can do on an every 3 to 6 month basis with your patients.
Yeah.
And one last thing, there are also legal safeguards available because in any legislation that governs advanced directives, there will always be an exception that allows you not to implement the directive if there are circumstances that you think that the patient had not taken into account at the time of framing it.
Yes. Yes. Thanks.
Thanks for that one.
Right. So we are at 6 o'clock. I think
I've tried to type out answers to some of the questions that we couldn't address orally. So hopefully most of them have been answered now.
Yeah.
We also do have a report that I can give you. I mean, I'll generate that and I'll give you where you'll have the questions which are unanswered and the ones that are answered.
Great.
okay, great, Mansi. Thanks, Mansi.
Yeah, thank you so
Will
much.
this be on YouTube later?
Of course,
Yes.
Share it
Yes,
later?
yes, it is available.
Okay.
the whole thing. So if somebody is willing to listen to all 2 hours of it, it is there.
Great.
Right.
Thank you all for joining,
Thank you.
to all the participants.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Dhwani. Thanks, Akshat.
Thank you, Rupan, Dhwani, and Sheila.
Thank you, everyone.
And Mansi for making all of this possible. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
all teamwork.
Hope
Okay.
it was useful to
Agarwal's
everyone.
screen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.